maybe just to start, because we've already, even in our first 10, 15 minutes, had so much good and in-depth discussion of composting, recycling, waste reduction, all of the sort of built-in to the system inequality in terms of where waste goes, what communities are burdened by it. Obviously, we're all here because of urgent concerns with climate change. So I won't necessarily get into all of that, but how many folks are aware that we have two, in New York City, and in other cities as well, we have two parallel sort of overlapping waste systems. And I don't know how aware folks are of that, but since the 1950s, we've had the Department of Sanitation, which collects waste and disposes of waste from our homes, which is a public service. It's paid for out of our general tax dollars. We don't get charged anything for it. There are debates about whether we should. And then, on the other hand, there's this enormous, sprawling private waste industry that private businesses have to contract with under New York City law to have their waste and recyclables carted away. And so that system's existed since the 1950s. I think it would be a great dissertation to go look at why that happened. In the archives of the 1950s. I suspect it was a retreat from public services and a move towards privatization, although we obviously never went wholesale into privatization, as many, many other municipalities have with waste collection. And so New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and since I started there, we've been involved in a really broad, diverse coalition looking to fundamentally reform the private waste system and industry in New York City, called Transform, Don't Trash New York City. We have labor in our coalition in the form of the Teamsters Union, which represents workers on both the public and private sides of the industry. We have NRDC, which Ashley mentioned, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, representing the EJ communities that are unfairly burdened with a lot of our waste infrastructure, the Alliance for Greater New York, NILPI, where I work, and then many, many other allies that have joined along the way. I mean, folks involved in waste at the local level. You mentioned BK Rott, they're a part of this. And Safe Streets advocates, as I'll say, that the trucks, particularly on the private side, are quite dangerous. So Safe Streets advocates like Transportation Alternatives have joined this coalition. And we were motivated by all of the interlocking sort of irrational injustices of the way in which this waste system has operated since the 1950s. There's a sort of, I don't want to say cliched because it's true, a sort of well-known connection to organized crime, which the city took on in the 1990s and started sort of investigating and regulating these private waste haulers that had engaged historically in cartel behavior, price fixing, anti-competitive, etc. But what the city never had the political will to look at was the environmental impact of the private waste system, the near total lack of recycling of highly recyclable waste streams, the racial injustice of waste being trucked in and out of a few overburdened communities, and then the worker injustice, which is also largely racial injustice, of the mostly Black and Latino workers who work in the private side of the industry, mostly in the middle of the night. I mean, this is sort of a literally unseen industry in many ways, because these private trucks are out collecting at midnight to 6 a.m., often out of sight of regulators, the general public, unless you're a grad student burning midnight oil, in which case you've almost certainly been almost run down by one of these trucks when you go to the deli. And, of course, the workers who are working these night shifts. So motivated by all... what's been really appealing about this campaign is that there's a very common sense reform that we're on the verge of passing this year that can take a really irrational system, and if it's done right, make it a win-win-win for workers, for communities, for greenhouse gas reduction, for green job creation, a Green New Deal. And so that's what's really exciting about this campaign. So to get into the way the existing system works a little bit, these are maps that the city just published as part of their plan. Under the current system, you have anywhere from 80 to 200. It's about 200 licensed private waste companies that every single business, about 200,000 businesses in New York, have to contract with. I don't know what CUNY uses for waste. It might be public sanitation. But every other private university, bodega, office building, factory has to find a private company to pick up their garbage. And because it's this really unregulated, capitalist, competitive system, the private waste haulers, to survive in some cases or to maximize their profit, pick up customers often wherever they can and cut corners wherever they can in order to charge lower prices and undermine their competition. So this is sort of what, we've got about 90 of these private companies collecting garbage citywide actively. This is an actual map of a customer spread for one of these 80 or 90 active companies. So it's all over the city. That's not all collected by one truck, of course, but the routes these trucks follow end up being way longer than they would need to be to actually get the waste from point A to point B. And that means long routes, long overnight hours for the drivers, fatigued driving, and a really gross expenditure of diesel fuel that's not even necessary. This is the city's proposed reform that we've been pushing for a few years, which is instead of having this free-for-all, to create it doesn't have a good catchy name yet, and we actually need to come up with one and encourage the city to take it up. It's called the zoned waste system. So instead of having a free-for-all where we have overlapping truck routes, duplicative truck routes, incentives for cost cutting and corner cutting, the city wants to create about 20 geographic zones and put out a request for proposals, basically put them out to bid so that we have only one or two or three of these private waste companies collecting in each commercial district. And this is an example of the efficiencies you get from this. If this were one of the 20 zones, all of this hauler's customers could fit in that one neighborhood in what looks to be Astoria, Long Island City, Queens. Here's a heat map of the sort of inefficiency of the current system. The dark red is more than 50 private garbage trucks on a block. As you can see, it's like a lot of garbage truck miles all over the city. Manhattan, where we are, fares particularly badly because it's obviously such a dense commercial district. This is, again, with a proposed system of having one or two or three haulers in each zone. The truck miles just go down drastically. I think from like an estimated 80,000 miles per night to about 30,000. So that's the reform that I think, thanks to the advocacy of a really broad coalition that I talked about going on for years now, where we've been just focusing on exposing all of the inefficiency and injustices of the current system. About 2 years ago, the Commissioner of Sanitation, Mayor de Blasio, and a key player in the City Council, Antonio Reynoso, who's the chair of the Sanitation Committee, and also the district he represents in North Brooklyn is the most overburdened district with private waste facilities. They all agreed to take this reform up. In many ways, we're following in the footsteps of West Coast cities that have done something similar. Folks mentioned San Francisco has a version of this system. Seattle has a version of this system. Most recently, Los Angeles adopted something similar to what we envision in New York. And, you know, in some ways, it's like healthcare. Often one of the first questions people ask when they're new to learning about the private waste system is, why don't we just have the city pick up all of it? And so this is kind of like I think that's a great idea. we'd love to have single payer or a national health system. What we're going to have to settle for politically is the waste version of Obamacare, and it's going to have its problems, to be sure, but it's going to be a whole lot better than what we have now. I'm confident of that. So I'll just take a few minutes and walk through a few of the different goals of what we want to attach to this new system, and then we can do questions and discussion now or later, whatever makes sense. So inequity in where the waste goes is a major feature of the private waste system. As Ashley mentioned, everything used to go to our local landfill on Staten Island called Fresh Kills. It was giant. It was undoubtedly churning out greenhouse gases as food waste and other waste decomposed in I think what was at the time the world's biggest landfill. That ran out of space. Mayor Giuliani in the 90s pledged to close it. There was a politics to that, of course, with wanting votes on Staten Island, and that was the coalition that elected him. It was a good thing to close it, I'm sure, in terms of local impacts, but what sort of sprang up in its place with very little planning was a sort of system of private waste transfer stations that use diesel trucks. This is one of the most inequitable sort of systems in New York City, and there are many. But you can see just, and this is a map that Politico did of data we gave them, but you can see that the size of these sort of represents the tonnage. Huge amount of waste going in and out of North Brooklyn, the South Bronx, with, of course, some of the highest asthma rates, if not the highest in the country, in parts of eastern Queens. This, although it's not the biggest amount of trucks, is in Jamaica, Queens, another community of color, a really badly sited set of transfer stations where you have schools and parks and private homes right across the street from one of the largest transfer stations. So with no planning, this is kind of what sprang up. And it's all connected because it's all private companies that are just making money exporting waste to out-of-state landfills and some incinerators as cheaply as possible. So one of our hopes is that, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. So there's a history of advocacy going back a couple decades in environmental justice communities to try to put some rules on the private transfer stations and get the city to commit to, if we're going to export waste, doing it in a much more equitable way. So a few of the victories we've had over the last couple decades, we're getting the city to build these giant new marine transfer stations, which use rail and barge to export waste from New York City. There's one on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that was very hard fought. It's near one of the wealthiest communities in the city, and folks did not want it there. That was a huge battle. There are others in Queens and Brooklyn. And so the city, almost all of those are open. So they're a huge public infrastructure investment in exporting waste in a somewhat better environmental way. And I want to stress that. I mean, it might be a little bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic with climate change. This is still just exporting waste to landfills, but it is doubtless a more equitable way to do it, where we're going to cut a lot of truck miles out by not trucking it up the highways to upstate, and we're going to cut a lot of trucks out of neighborhoods like North Brooklyn and the South Bronx with these facilities. These are city facilities, so one of our most ambitious goals with the Transform Don't Trash campaign is to try to get the commercial private haulers to start taking waste to these things at night, which is preferable to what they're doing now. We did, this was a waste equity bill that passed last summer that's going to cut down the amount of transfer station tons in North Brooklyn and the South Bronx in parallel with those new facilities opening. Second goal is to address the really low recycling rate in the private waste sector. And, this is one where I think, the Green New Deal is really something we want to embrace and highlight here. I think so far in presenting this commercial waste zone plan, the city has rightly focused on the huge inefficiency of the current system and the reductions in truck miles and the unfortunate number of pedestrian and cyclist deaths we've had caused by private waste trucks. But from a greenhouse gas perspective, it's everything you all were talking about at the beginning. Not burying food waste, plastics, et cetera, in landfills is probably the biggest thing, much bigger than the actual collection truck emissions. So currently, there's very little data on what happens in the private waste system, but what data we have suggests that it's only about a 20% recycling rate. And with China and other countries that have accepted a lot of recyclable waste from the US, sort of clamping down on quality standards, saying they don't want to take contaminated recyclables, et cetera, there's been a real crisis in the markets for recyclable materials, and we're seeing that the private haulers and transfer stations are recycling even less in response to those market challenges. So another ambitious thing we want to attach to this new system is high standards that these haulers have to meet in terms of proving that this stuff is getting recycled. I think waste reduction needs to be a much bigger feature. Again, we're talking about the commercial sector. So it's every time we go to a restaurant, every time we are at work or wherever we work. It's everything we're throwing out. And I don't know how things are here, but if my office building is any guide, it's like we're on our own. We don't even know what's getting recycled. And our private hauler and our landlord tell us virtually nothing. So there's a massive amount of customer education and incentives in terms of pricing that we think should be attached to this new system. It should cost more to put something in a landfill-bound waste bag than in a recycling waste bag. And there should be some reward for customers that actually just cut down on their waste by, not doing what we're all doing today, bringing our own coffee cups, cutting down on takeout containers, composting the food waste, et cetera. Safer streets, I mentioned, another huge goal. Obviously, the fatigued driving due to the long shifts and the sort of grossly irrational routes are increasing the risk any given night of crashes involving these 30-ton waste trucks. That's the trend in federal data on the left in terms of serious and fatal crashes among the largest 20 private haulers. It goes contrary to the general trend in reducing traffic deaths due to the city's Vision Zero program. So this has been, I think, one of the most politically powerful pieces that we've been advancing to push this new reform. And then finally, justice for the workers in the commercial waste industry is a real big part of our reform. Again, as this private system was created and as unions, ironically, when there was sort of a cartel among these private waste haulers, it was probably better for the workers in a way. And there were instances in which, in the 80s, 70s, labor unions were sort of negotiating with the cartel all at once, and wages were typically higher. That's been eroded significantly over the decades. So work in the private waste industry pays a lot less than it used to. The demographics of workers working in that industry have changed. A lot of them are very vulnerable workers, recent immigrants, undocumented folks, formerly incarcerated folks, who are very vulnerable to exploitation. And there's been a well-publicized case in the Bronx that ProPublica has done a fantastic investigative reporting series on how one of these immigrant workers actually died on the truck a year ago, and his employer tried to cover it up and pretend he was a quote-unquote crazed homeless man who just threw himself in front of a trash truck. So check that out. But this is really like the linchpin of the reform, is how do we build wage standards in? Again, if we're going to have these private waste companies bidding for the right to collect waste in each district, we want to make sure that There's some sort of a living wage standard, benefit standards, and safety protections in terms of not working 16-hour overnight shifts and things like that. So this is a sort of summary of all the transformational change that we're looking for. And then just to quickly walk through where the policy is now and the politics of it. So the basic concept has been embraced by the mayor's office, the commissioner of sanitation, and some key city council members. Now we actually have to pass a policy. It can't all be done by executive, by the mayor. We have to have city council legislation to create this new system. And then, as with many things, the devil's going to be in the details in terms of, are we going to have a really ambitious transformative system that sets high recycling standards, where the city is doing everything possible to get these companies to invest in better recycling facilities, composting facilities, employing folks at the community level to help move things into compost, for example, like BK Rott and others who actually have a vision of bicycle-powered waste transport, doing things at the community level. We really want them to be part of this new system, but how do we get these private waste haulers to make those investments and in those partnerships? So we want to really load this RFP that the city is going to roll out up with all of these social goals, environmental goals, minority and women-owned business inclusion goals, you name it. We would really like this to be transformative. On the other side, we have very well-financed opponents who don't want any of this reform to happen, and if it's got to happen, they want it to be as watered down as possible. Again, the Obamacare analogy is probably pretty good. So the Real Estate Board of New York, the same folks who don't want you to have rent-controlled apartments, hate this policy. And actually, we're working with ProPublica to uncover now the ways in which REBNY has been probably secretly bankrolling the private waste industry's lobbying efforts against this. The private waste industry itself, as some of them have seen that the writing's on the wall and that reform, there's a lot of support for reform. Some of them have chosen to sort of remain neutral and see where this ends up, but some of them are very vocally opposed to it, and again have really put in quite a shocking amount of money into lobbying. And I'm sure we'll see TV ads and all the rest of it hammering the mayor within the next 6 months around this policy. So we're excited about it, but we have a big battle coming up in 2019, I think in the city council particularly, where we need to get a strong majority of council members to support this, and they're going to be facing a lot of opposition from donors and moneyed interests to not do this. And we need everyone on board. I guess I'll end with an appeal. There's the first public hearing for the commercial waste zone plan that the city has is actually in a couple weeks. And we're trying to turn a lot of people out to offer some public comments in support of the plan, and specifically in support of the strongest possible plan that sets really ambitious goals. So if any of you would like to join or come testify on your own or your community's behalf, please see me after and we'll all be there.